My name is Neha Vitrala, and I'm from Fulton County, Georgia, a place that's been plastered across headlines recently as federal agencies moved in to seize local election data. In early 2026, the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation began obtaining election materials and voter data from local jurisdictions, including counties like mine, under the justification of investigating election integrity. That objective on its own is not controversial. What is controversial is how expansive these efforts have become, and what they now involve. These requests extend beyond publicly accessible voter information and into categories of data that are far more sensitive. Once that threshold is crossed, the question shifts from access to control. Who holds the data, how it is used, and whether those uses remain tied to the original purpose. That is where the legal tension emerges. Federal agencies are authorized to investigate violations into election law, but election administration is structured around state control, and both federal and state frameworks impose limits on how voter information can be disclosed and handled. Those limits were designed with a clear assumption that voter data would not be collected and centralized at this scale. When that assumption no longer holds, the effects are not confined to legal doctrine. They reach voters directly. Participation relies on a baseline expectation of privacy, and when that expectation becomes uncertain, participation itself becomes less secure. This video examines that conflict between federal investigative authority and voter privacy, identifies where current legal protections fail to account for large-scale data collection, and proposes a set of enforceable safeguards that preserve election integrity efforts without allowing them to expand into unchecked access to sensitive voter information. To understand why this situation matters, you have to look at how voter data is structured in the United States. Voter registration is managed at the state level. Each state maintains its own voter rolls, sets its own procedures for registration, and determines what information is public versus protected. That system is not accidental. It reflects a constitutional structure where elections are primarily administered by states, not the federal government. At the same time, federal law still plays a role. Laws like the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act require states to maintain accurate voter lists and allow for certain types of oversight. The federal government can investigate violations of election law, but those laws were written with limits in mind. They allow access to records relevant to an investigation, not unrestricted access to large-scale datasets containing sensitive personal information. What's happening now pushes against that distinction. Recent federal requests have sought not just basic voter registration data, but expanded datasets, information that can include identifiers like driver's license numbers, partial social security data, contact information, and detailed voting records. Once data reaches that level of sensitivity, it stops being just election data. It becomes personal data, data that can be traced back to individual voters and potentially used beyond its original context. And that's where the issue stops being procedural and starts becoming structural. There are three main groups affected here. First, state governments. They are responsible for maintaining voter rolls and protecting the information within them. Many states have laws that explicitly restrict access to sensitive voter data, so when federal agencies request that information, states are forced to choose between compliance and their own legal obligations. Second, federal agencies. The Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are operating under the justification of enforcing election law. Their position is that access to data is necessary to investigate potential irregularities. And third, most importantly, voters. Because regardless of how this is framed legally, the effects land on individuals. When voter data is collected at scale, especially without clear boundaries, it introduces uncertainty, not necessarily about whether someone is eligible to vote, but about what happens to their information after they do. And that uncertainty is not evenly distributed. Communities that have historically faced barriers to voting, naturalized citizens, minority voters, lower-income populations, are more likely to be affected by errors in data systems and more likely to feel the consequences of those errors. That's where this connects to equity, because when the cost of participation feels higher for some groups than others, the system stops being equally accessible. There are already legal frameworks in place that are supposed to regulate this space. At the federal level, the Privacy Act of 1974 limits how government agencies collect, use, and share personal data. It requires transparency and restricts disclosure without proper justification. There are also federal security standards, like those under FISMA and the guidelines from NIST, that govern how sensitive information should be stored and protected. At the state level, protections are often even more explicit. Many states restrict access to identifiers like social security numbers and driver's license data. Some states only allow limited portions of voter rolls to be publicly accessed while keeping more sensitive fields confidential. And there have been prior attempts at large-scale federal data collection. In 2017, a federal commission requested extensive voter data from states. That effort faced immediate pushback, legal challenges, and ultimately collapsed, partly because of concerns about privacy, overreach, and lack of safeguards. So the concern here isn't new. What's new is the scale, and the fact that similar efforts are now being carried out through enforcement mechanisms rather than advisory ones. The existing frameworks were not designed for this situation. They assume that data collection is targeted, limited, and tied to specific cases. They do not account for bulk acquisition of voter information across multiple jurisdictions. That creates gaps. First, there is no clear standard for how much data can be requested in a single investigation. Relevant to an investigation is a flexible phrase, and flexibility in this context expands authority. Second, there is limited transparency. Voters are not notified when their data is included in these datasets. States may not know how the data will be used once it leaves their control. Third, data sharing across agencies is not always visible. Once information is in federal systems, it can be accessed or cross-referenced in ways that were not part of the original request. And finally, there is the issue of accuracy. Data matching systems, especially those used to verify citizenship or eligibility, are not perfect. Errors happen, and when those errors occur in systems that operate at scale, they don't just affect individuals, they affect entire groups. If participation in an election comes with uncertainty about how your personal data might be used, some people will opt out, not because they're ineligible, but because the risk feels unclear. That changes voter behavior. So then the question becomes, how do you allow legitimate election investigations to continue without creating a system that collects and distributes voter data? The answer is not a single rule. It's a framework that governs the entire life cycle of that data. First, data collection needs to be limited at the source. Federal agencies should only be allowed to request the minimum amount of data necessary for a specific investigation, with clear justification for each category of information. Broad, undefined requests should not be permitted. Second, use of that data needs to be restricted. Information collected for one investigation should not be repurposed for unrelated uses or shared across agencies without formal approval, public disclosure, and legal basis. Third, the data itself needs to be secured. If sensitive voter information is collected, it must be stored in restricted systems with limited access, audit tracking, and clear accountability for how it's handled. Fourth, retention needs to be controlled. Data should not be stored indefinitely. Once an investigation is complete, the information should be either deleted or returned with documentation confirming that process. Fifth, voter-level protections need to be built in. No individual should face removal from voter rolls or legal consequences based solely on automated data matching. Any action must include verification, notice, and an opportunity to respond. Together, these safeguards do not prevent investigation, but protect voter privacy. At a basic level, this issue comes down to how power is structured. The federal government has a role in enforcing election law. States have a role in administering elections. Voters have a right to participate without unnecessary exposure of their personal information. When those roles remain balanced, the system functions as intended. When that balance shifts, when access expands without clear limits, the effects are not just legal. People adjust, and in a proper democracy, even small shifts in trust matter. A secure election system is not just one that prevents fraud. It has to make voters feel safe engaging with it. And that requires more than authority. It requires limits and protection of voters.